May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Across Canada, from Halifax to Vancouver, celebrations erupted in the streets. Church bells rang, strangers embraced, and newspapers declared the end of the nightmare that had consumed the world for 6 years. In prisoner-of-war camps scattered across the country, German soldiers prepared for repatriation to their defeated homeland. But in a modest facility outside Montreal, Quebec, something unprecedented was happening. When Captain Edmund Thornhill announced to a group of German women prisoners that they were free to return home, 12 of them did the unthinkable. They begged to stay. These weren't ordinary prisoners. They were members of the German Women's Auxiliary Corps, captured during the final chaotic months of the war in Europe. Young women who had served the Reich as radio operators, nurses, clerks, and administrative personnel, now facing a choice that would define the rest of their lives. What could possibly make someone choose to remain in enemy captivity rather than return to freedom in their own country? Before we discover what happened to these remarkable women, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The answer to that question begins not with grand political statements or dramatic moments of conversion, but with something far simpler and more profound. It begins with a sandwich, a Montreal smoked meat sandwich to be precise, piled high with tender, peppery beef that had been cured for weeks, steamed until it fell apart at the touch of a fork, then stacked between slices of fresh rye bread with nothing but a smear of yellow mustard. For women who hadn't tasted real meat in years, who had survived on watery soup and stale bread, that first bite represented something they had been taught Americans and Canadians could never offer: kindness without cruelty, generosity without demands, humanity across enemy lines. At the center of this story stands Helga Schroeder, a 24-year-old communications specialist from Bremen. She had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1943, believing she was serving her country's defense against those who wanted to destroy it. She had operated radio equipment in France, transmitting coded messages she never fully understood, following orders without question, because that was what good German women did for the fatherland. Now, standing before Captain Thornhill with 11 other women on that momentous day in May, she spoke in careful, accented English that she had learned during her months in captivity. "Captain, we know what we ask is unusual, but Germany is not our home anymore. The Germany we served, we discovered, was not the Germany we believed in." Her words carried the weight of a transformation that had begun 8 months earlier, on a freezing November day when she and 47 other German women had stepped off a transport truck into a Canadian winter, expecting the worst. What they found, instead, would challenge everything they thought they knew about their enemies, about themselves, and about what it truly meant to be given a second chance. This is their story. November 19, 1944. The transport truck rumbled through the gates of the prisoner-of-war facility just as the first serious snowfall of the season began to blanket Montreal. Helga Schroeder pressed her face against the cold window, watching fat snowflakes swirl in the gathering dusk. Beside her, Dorothea Vogel, a nurse from Stuttgart, whom everyone called Dora, clutched her medical bag with white-knuckled hands. Neither woman spoke. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said during the long journey from the port in Halifax. The truck stopped with a mechanical wheeze. Canadian guards opened the rear doors, and Arctic air rushed in, stealing what little warmth the cramped space had offered. Helga was the first to step down, her worn boots crunching on fresh snow. She had expected many things from this moment. Hostility, certainly. Perhaps cruelty. What she didn't expect was the sight of Captain Edmund Thornhill standing in the compound yard, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air, waiting to address them personally. The 48 women assembled in ragged formation. They wore what remained of their gray auxiliary uniforms, some patched with mismatched fabric, others torn at the seams from months of wear. Wilhelmina Richter, called Mina by her friends, stood ramrod straight despite the cold, her clerk's training showing in her perfect posture. Elfriede Neumann, the radio operator, kept her eyes fixed on the ground. Hilda Bergman, who had coordinated supply lines for a field hospital, wrapped her thin arms around herself against the wind. Captain Thornhill stepped forward. He was a tall man with graying hair and eyes that held neither anger nor pity, just a kind of weary professionalism that came from years of military service. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the compound. "You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. You will be treated fairly and humanely. You will work, you will follow rules, and you will be safe here. That is my promise to you." Helga translated quietly for those whose English was weak or non-existent. She watched the captain's face for signs of deception, for the cruelty she had been told to expect from Canada's soldiers. But his expression remained steady, almost gentle. Behind him stood two guards, Sergeant Lucien Gauthier, a stocky French-Canadian with kind eyes and a thick accent that blended French and English in ways that fascinated Helga. Beside him was Corporal Wallace Reed, a younger man from Ontario who looked barely old enough to be in uniform, his red hair visible beneath his cap. The women were led to their barracks, a long wooden building with rows of simple bunks. It was cold but clean, with real mattresses and woolen blankets folded at the foot of each bed. As Helga set down her small bundle of possessions, the only things she had carried from her previous life, Dora whispered in German, "This cannot be real. There must be a reason they're being kind. No one shows mercy without wanting something in return." Helga nodded slowly, but something in Captain Thornhill's voice had planted a seed of doubt about everything she thought she knew about her enemies. The propaganda had promised brutality. Instead, they had been given blankets and a promise of safety. The first morning in the camp began with uncertainty. Helga woke to the sound of boots on wooden floors and commands shouted in English. For a moment she forgot where she was, then reality crashed back. She was a prisoner in Canada, thousands of miles from home, in a country she had been taught to fear. The other women rose slowly, their faces pale and drawn from fitful sleep in an unfamiliar place. Sergeant Gauthier appeared at the barracks door, his expression neutral but not unkind. "Breakfast," he announced in his thick French-Canadian accent. "You come now, s'il vous plaît?" The women followed him across the snowy compound to a dining hall that smelled of wood smoke and something else, something that made Helga's empty stomach clench with sudden, painful hunger. It was the smell of meat, real meat, cooking. They filed into the hall and stopped, staring at what awaited them on the long wooden tables. Plates. Real plates. Not the tin cups and bowls they had expected. And on those plates sat sandwiches, thick sandwiches on dark rye bread stuffed with what looked like mountains of dark, glistening meat. Steam rose from the piles of beef, and the sharp, clean smell of mustard cut through the air. Dora grabbed Helga's arm, her fingers digging in hard. "What is this?" she whispered in German. "Some kind of test? Do they want to see if we'll fight over food like animals?" But Corporal Reed was gesturing to the tables, his young face open and almost embarrassed. "Please sit, eat. It's Montreal's smoked meat, best in the world." He said it with such simple pride, as though he were sharing something precious with guests rather than feeding enemy prisoners. Helga sat slowly, the other women following her lead. She picked up the sandwich with trembling hands. The bread was fresh, still slightly warm. The meat was piled so high she could barely fit the sandwich in her mouth. She glanced at Captain Thornhill, who stood near the door, watching them. He nodded once, a gesture that seemed to say it was truly all right, that this wasn't a trick. She took a bite. The taste exploded across her tongue, rich, peppery beef that had been cured and smoked until it achieved a flavor she had never experienced before. The meat was tender enough to melt, the fat running with the juices, the mustard adding just enough sharpness to cut through the richness. She had not tasted beef, real beef, in more than 3 years. In Germany, by the end, they had been eating potato, peels, and calling it stew. Around her, the other women were experiencing the same revelation. Mina's eyes filled with tears as she chewed. Elfrida made a small sound, almost like a sob. Hilda ate slowly, reverently, as though the sandwich were something holy. They had expected cruelty. They had been given abundance, and in that moment, in that first overwhelming taste of Montreal smoked meat on rye bread, something fundamental began to shift in how these German women saw their Canadian captors. The Montreal winter descended with a ferocity that none of the German women had anticipated. They had known cold in Europe, certainly, but this Canadian cold was different. It bit through layers of clothing, turned breath to ice crystals in the air, and made the short walk from barracks to dining hall feel like an Arctic expedition. By early December, temperatures regularly dropped to 20 below zero, and the wind that swept across the compound carried snow like tiny knives. Helga noticed the first act of unexpected kindness on a particularly brutal morning. Elfrida had been coughing through the night, a deep rattling sound that spoke of chest congestion and possible pneumonia. When Sergeant Gautier arrived for morning count, he heard the cough and disappeared without explanation. He returned 20 minutes later with Nurse Beatrice Aldridge, a stern-faced woman in her 40s who carried a medical bag and an expression that brooked no argument. "Let me see her," Nurse Aldridge said, not asking permission but simply expecting cooperation. Dora, with her nursing training, tried to explain that she could care for Elfrida, but the Canadian nurse shook her head. "You're a prisoner too. You need rest same as her. Now move aside and let me work." She examined Elfrida with practiced efficiency, then produced a bottle of cough syrup and antibiotics that would have been worth their weight in gold in wartime Germany. 3 times a day until it's gone. No arguments. The kindness spread in small ways that accumulated like the snow outside. Corporal Reed brought extra blankets when he noticed the women shivering during evening count. He didn't make a show of it, simply left them folded on bunks with a quiet, "Nights get colder here than you're used to." Sergeant Gautier started teaching basic French phrases during the work shifts, using his hands and exaggerated expressions to communicate when words failed. "Le froid, he would say, hugging himself and shivering dramatically. "Cold, you understand? C'est le froid." Helga found herself drawn to these language lessons. Her English was improving rapidly, but French was a beautiful puzzle she enjoyed solving. Gautier seemed pleased by her interest, spending extra time helping her with pronunciation. "You have good ear," he told her one afternoon while they worked in the administrative building, sorting supplies. "My grandmother, she come from Alsace, German and French both. You remind me of her stories, how she learned new language when she come to Quebec." The comparison to his grandmother seemed significant somehow. He wasn't seeing her as an enemy, but as a person with the same capacity for adaptation and growth as his own family. It was a small thing, but it planted seeds of possibility in Helga's mind. If this French-Canadian sergeant could see past her uniform and her accent, perhaps redemption was possible after all. Christmas approached, and with it came new questions about how they would mark the holiday in this strange place. The women whispered among themselves, wondering if their captors would acknowledge the season or ignore it entirely, leaving them to face the loneliest Christmas of their lives in silence. January 1945 arrived with news that shattered what remained of the women's connection to their former lives. The International Red Cross had finally managed to establish contact with families in Germany, and letters began arriving at the camp in thin, battered envelopes that had traveled across an ocean and through a war zone. Captain Thornhill distributed them personally during evening assembly, calling out names in his careful pronunciation of German surnames. Helga received 2 letters. The first was from a neighbor in Bremen, written in shaking handwriting that spoke of exhaustion and grief. Her family's apartment building had been destroyed in a bombing raid in October. Her mother and younger sister had been in the cellar when it collapsed. They had not survived. Her father's whereabouts were unknown. He had been conscripted into the Volkssturm, the desperate last-ditch militia of old men and boys, and had not been heard from since November. The neighbor ended with a simple, devastating sentence. "There is nothing left here for you to come home to." Helga read the letter 3 times before the words fully penetrated. Then she folded it carefully, placed it in her pocket, and walked outside into the snow. She stood in the compound yard, letting the cold wind numb her face, and tried to process the fact that her family was gone, that the apartment where she had learned to read, where her mother had taught her to cook, where her sister had practiced piano every evening, was now just rubble and ash. Dora found her there an hour later, her own letter clutched in her hand. The nurse's family in Stuttgart had survived, but her father had been badly injured in a factory accident, and her mother was struggling to care for him alone. "They need me," Dora whispered, her voice breaking. "But how can I help them from here? How can I do anything when I'm thousands of miles away, locked behind wire?" Inside the barracks, similar scenes unfolded. Mina learned that her fiancé had been killed at the Battle of the Bulge. Hilda discovered that her brother was missing in action on the Eastern Front. Of the 48 women, only 12 received news that could be called hopeful, and even that hope was tempered by reports of destroyed cities, food shortages, and a country descending into chaos as Allied armies closed in from all sides. But it was the other news, the news that arrived not in letters but in newspapers, that Captain Thornhill began allowing into the compound, that truly shook the foundations of everything the women believed. Reports were emerging from the Eastern Front of Soviet forces discovering camps. Not prisoner of war camps like the one they inhabited, but something far darker. Places with names like Majdanek and Auschwitz. Places where the systematic murder of civilians had occurred on a scale that seemed impossible to comprehend. Helga sat in the small camp library, a newspaper spread before her, reading accounts that made her hands shake. Photographs showed skeletal prisoners behind wire, mass graves, evidence of industrial-scale killing. The articles described gas chambers, crematoriums, the deliberate extermination of Jews, Roma, disabled people, political prisoners. Millions dead. The revelations about the concentration camps created a crisis of identity among the German women that went far deeper than homesickness or fear of repatriation. They had served a regime that committed atrocities beyond imagination, and the weight of that knowledge sat heavy on their shoulders. Helga found herself unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling of the barracks and asking questions that had no comfortable answers. Had she known? Could she have known? Did ignorance absolve her of responsibility, or did it make her complicity even worse? It was in this state of moral anguish that Father Augustin Marchand first arrived at the camp. He was a Catholic priest from a parish in Montreal, a small man with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that never seemed to stop moving as he spoke. He had come, he explained to Captain Thornhill, because his congregation believed that even enemies deserved spiritual comfort, and because the war was ending and it was time to think about reconciliation rather than revenge. Father Marchand began holding weekly services in the camp's small chapel, speaking in a mixture of French, English, and surprisingly adequate German. But more importantly, he brought with him members of his congregation. Mrs. Constance Fletcher was among the first, a school teacher in her 50s who had lost her son at Dieppe. She came expecting to feel hatred for these German women. Instead, she found young people who reminded her painfully of her son's classmates, scared and confused and desperate for some sense of meaning in the chaos. Then came the Abramsons. Mr. and Mrs. Abramson were Jewish immigrants from Poland who had arrived in Montreal in 1938, barely escaping the Nazi occupation. They had lost family, dozens of relatives who had not been able to flee in time. When Father Marchand asked if anyone from the Jewish community would be willing to visit the camp to extend a hand of forgiveness to these German women, most people thought he was mad. But the Abramsons came. Their first visit was tense. Helga, chosen to translate because of her improving English, stood before them and saw in their eyes the weight of everything her country had done to their people. Mrs. Abramson spoke first, her voice steady but strained. We came because Father Marchand asked us, because our faith teaches us about forgiveness, even when it seems impossible. But we need to know. Did you know what was happening to people like us? The question hung in the air like an accusation. Helga wanted to say yes, wanted to claim knowledge that might make her seem less naive, less complicit through ignorance, but the truth was more complicated and more painful. We knew that Jewish people were being sent away, she said quietly. We were told it was resettlement, labor camps. We believed what we were told because it was easier than questioning. I am ashamed of that now. Mrs. Abramson studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Shame is a beginning, she said. The question is what you do with it. Over the following weeks, the Abramsons continued to visit, bringing with them an offer that seemed impossible. They wanted to teach the women how to cook traditional Montreal smoked meat, the very food that had first shown them unexpected kindness. Spring arrived late in Montreal, the snow finally retreating in early April to reveal muddy ground and the first brave shoots of green. With the warming weather came news that made the entire camp hold its breath. Germany was collapsing. Soviet forces had taken Berlin. Hitler was reported dead. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe officially ended. Victory in Europe Day brought celebrations across Canada, but in the prisoner of war camp outside Montreal, the mood was somber and uncertain. Captain Thornhill called a meeting of all the German women on May 10th. They gathered in the dining hall, the same place where they had first tasted Montreal smoked meat 6 months earlier. The captain stood before them with official documents in his hand, his expression grave but not unkind. "Ladies," he began, "the war is over. The Canadian government will begin repatriation procedures for all prisoners of war. You will be processed and returned to Germany within the coming weeks." The words should have brought relief, even joy. They were going home. They were free. But as Helga looked around at her fellow prisoners, she saw only anxiety and fear on their faces. What home were they returning to? The letters from Germany painted a picture of utter devastation. Cities were in ruins. The economy had collapsed. Millions were homeless, starving, displaced. The country they had served no longer existed in any recognizable form. More than that, what kind of reception would they receive? They were German women who had been captured by the enemy, who had spent months in foreign captivity. The whispers from returning male prisoners suggested that those who had been captured were viewed with suspicion as weak, as potentially corrupted by enemy influence. And given what they now knew about their country's crimes, given the shame and guilt they carried, the prospect of returning felt less like liberation and more like stepping into an abyss. That evening, Helga gathered with Dora, Mina, Elfrida, and Hilda in a quiet corner of the barracks. They spoke in low voices, wrestling with a question that seemed impossible to answer. "I have nothing to go back to," Helga said quietly. "My family is dead. My city is rubble. And I cannot face being part of a Germany that did those things. Not yet. Maybe not ever." Dora nodded slowly. "My parents need me. I know that. But Mrs. Abramson has offered to help me bring them here if I stay. She said there are immigration programs for displaced persons, that if I wanted to make a new life in Canada, she would sponsor me." The offer seemed too generous to be real, but the nurse's voice carried hope for the first time in months. "The Fletchers told me the same," Mina added. "Mrs. Fletcher said I could work as a clerk in her husband's office while I learned better English. They would help me apply for residency." She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Is it wrong to want to stay? Does choosing Canada mean we're abandoning our duty to help rebuild Germany?" The question echoed what Father Marchand had asked them weeks earlier, and none of them had easy answers. For 3 days, the women debated among themselves in hushed conversations that stretched late into the night. The barracks became a place of agonized soul-searching as each woman weighed her past against her future, duty against desire, fear against hope. Helga found herself becoming the unofficial leader of those who were leaning towards staying, not because she sought the role, but because her fluent English and her relationship with the Abramsons made her the natural bridge between the prisoners and their potential new lives. On May 13th, Helga requested a private meeting with Captain Thornhill. She entered his office with her heart pounding, carrying with her the hopes and fears of 11 other women who had entrusted her to speak for them. The captain gestured to a chair, his expression unreadable. "Miss Schroeder, what can I do for you?" Helga had rehearsed her words carefully, but now that the moment had arrived, they seemed inadequate to express the enormity of what she was asking. She took a deep breath and began, "Captain, I come to speak for myself and for 11 other women in this camp. We have discussed the repatriation orders, and we have made a decision that we know is unusual, perhaps unprecedented. We wish to request permission to remain in Canada rather than return to Germany." The silence that followed her words seemed to stretch forever. Captain Thornhill leaned back in his chair, studying her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, but she held his gaze. Finally, he spoke. "You understand what you're asking. You would be choosing to remain in what is technically still enemy captivity rather than accept your freedom." "With respect, Captain, we are asking for a different kind of freedom," Helga replied, her voice gaining strength. "The freedom to build new lives without the weight of our country's crimes pulling us down at every step. The freedom to live in a place where we have been shown kindness instead of returning to a place where we will face only suspicion and shame." She paused, then added quietly, "Germany is broken, Captain. Perhaps we are broken too, but here we have found people willing to help us heal." Thornhill was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming on his desk. "I'll need to present this to my superiors in Ottawa. This isn't a decision I can make alone. The legal implications are significant. You're prisoners of war, not immigrants. The Geneva Convention doesn't have provisions for prisoners requesting to remain with their captors." He met her eyes directly. "But I will advocate for you, all of you. In my months commanding this facility, I've watched you transform from defeated enemies into women genuinely trying to atone for your country's actions and build better futures. That deserves consideration." 2 days later, Captain Thornhill called a general assembly. All 48 women gathered in the dining hall, tension visible in every rigid posture and clenched hand. The captain stood before them with a telegram from Ottawa in his hand. "I have received preliminary approval for an unprecedented arrangement," he announced. "Those who wish to remain in Canada may apply for displaced persons status and eventual immigration. Those who wish to return to Germany will be processed for repatriation as originally planned." The announcement created a division in the camp that was both painful and necessary. Of the 48 women, 12 chose to pursue the difficult path of staying in Canada. 36 decided to return to Germany, their reasons as varied and valid as those who chose to remain. Some had families waiting for them. Others felt a moral obligation to help rebuild their shattered country. A few simply could not imagine calling any place but Germany home, regardless of what it had become. The women who chose repatriation were not abandoning hope or choosing despair. Many of them had been profoundly changed by their months in Canadian captivity, and they intended to carry those lessons home with them. One woman, a former radio operator named Clara, stood during a final gathering and spoke words that brought tears to many eyes. "I am returning to Germany not as a defeated prisoner, but as someone who has learned what reconciliation looks like. If a Jewish family who lost relatives in the camps can show me forgiveness, then perhaps there is hope for all of us." The preparations for departure became a strange mixture of farewell and celebration. The women who were staying helped those who were leaving pack their meager belongings. The Abramsons donated clothing and supplies for the journey. Mrs. Fletcher organized a collection at her church, raising funds to ensure each returning woman would have at least some money when they arrived in the displaced persons camps in Europe. Sergeant Gautier, whose French lessons had become a beloved routine, gave each departing woman a small handwritten phrasebook of English and French words. "Maybe someday you come back to visit," he said gruffly, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You know how to order Montreal smoked meat now, eh?" Corporal Reed, the young guard from Ontario who had brought extra blankets during the coldest nights, shook each woman's hand and wished them luck with a sincerity that transcended the former enemy lines. The morning of June 20th arrived with clear skies and warm sunshine, as if nature itself was acknowledging the significance of the day. The 36 women bound for Germany assembled in the compound yard, no longer in formation, but in small clusters of friends who had sustained each other through captivity. They wore civilian clothes donated by Montreal families, their old gray uniforms packed away or discarded, symbols of a past they were trying to move beyond. Captain Thornhill addressed them with words that Helga would remember for the rest of her life. "You came to us as enemies. You leave as friends. I hope you will carry with you the knowledge that Canadians can show mercy without forgetting justice, and that even in war, humanity can prevail if we choose to let it." He paused, then added, "Germany will need good people to rebuild it. You are good people. I have no doubt of that." Helga and the other 11 women who were staying stood in a line to say farewell. There were embraces, tears, promises to write letters. Dora held tightly to a friend who was returning to care for her aging parents in Hamburg. "Tell them what you learned here," Dora whispered. "Tell them that enemies can become friends if we are brave enough to try." 25 years later, on a crisp autumn morning in 1970, Helga Schroeder-Abramson stood behind the counter of her delicatessen on Saint Laurent Boulevard in Montreal. The shop's windows displayed hand-painted signs in French, English, and even a little German, advertising the best Montreal smoked meat in the city. The smell of curing beef, peppery spices, and fresh rye bread filled the air, drawing customers from blocks away. She was 50 years old now, her dark hair streaked with silver, her once uncertain English now flawless and touched with the distinctive accent of a Montrealaise. The Abramsons had sponsored her immigration, helped her find work, and eventually welcomed her into their family when she married their nephew David in 1952. She had taken their name proudly, understanding it as both a gift and a responsibility. She carried the name of a Jewish family who had chosen forgiveness over hatred, redemption over revenge. Dora had become Dr. Dorothea Aldridge after marrying the son of Nurse Beatrice Aldridge, the stern Canadian nurse who had first treated Elfrida's pneumonia. She now worked at Montreal General Hospital, training a new generation of nurses and often speaking to medical students about the importance of treating all patients with dignity, regardless of who they were or where they came from. Of the 12 who had stayed, all had built lives that honored the second chance they had been given. Mina worked as an office administrator and had brought her elderly mother to Canada in 1953. Elfrida taught languages at a Montreal high school. Hilda had married Sergeant Gautier in a wedding that brought together French, Canadian, Jewish, and German families in a celebration that the local newspaper called a symbol of post-war reconciliation. But perhaps the most meaningful connection was the one Helga maintained with those who had returned to Germany. Letters arrived regularly from across the Atlantic, filled with stories of rebuilding, of new families, of a Germany slowly transforming itself. Clara, the woman who had spoken so movingly about carrying reconciliation home, had become a teacher in Hamburg, educating young Germans about the importance of facing their history honestly. This morning, Helga was preparing for a special event. The city of Montreal was hosting a conference on immigration and refugee integration, and she had been invited to speak about her experience. As she sliced smoked meat for the lunch rush, she thought about what she would say, about how to capture the journey from enemy prisoner to Canadian citizen, in words that could do justice to its complexity. A customer entered, an elderly Jewish man who had been coming to her shop for 15 years. He didn't know her history, knew only that she made the best smoked meat sandwich he had ever tasted. "The usual, Helga?" he asked with a smile. She nodded, piling the tender, peppery beef high on rye bread, adding just a touch of mustard, exactly as she had been taught all those years ago. As she handed him the sandwich, she thought about that first morning in the camp, about the taste that had begun her transformation. Food had been more than sustenance. It had been a language of kindness when words failed, a gesture of humanity across enemy lines, a bridge between past and future.